This is Sarah Gancharski interviewing Enid Leigh for the Knutsford Memories of World War II project. Okay, would you like to start by just telling us your name and the year you were born?
My name is Enid Leigh and I was born in 1930.
And what was your connection to Knutsford during the war years, 1939 to 45?
Well, I lived at Peacock Lodge, Tabley, but I've always lived, I was born in Cheshire and I've always lived in and around Knutsford.
And whereabouts in particular in the Knutsford area were you living around the time that war broke out?
When war broke out, I was at Peacock Lodge, Tabley, living with my grandfather, who was the gatekeeper for the Leicester Warren estate, and his duties were opening the gates. It was rather a feudal system. Because my father was a reservist and had gone into the war, my mother and sister and myself went to live with him because my grandmother had died and he was not looking after himself, so that was why we went to live with him.
And what was life like at Peacock Lodge, which is one of the lodge gates for Tabley House?
Well, it was quite primitive, as it was in those days. It was a feudal system. You were sort of very much one of the tenants. The fuel was short and my grandfather didn't drive, so we had to walk or cycle everywhere. But we were able to get sort of wood out of the estate. We didn't sort of never have any fire or anything like that, but we had to cook on a fire. We had a big black range in the lodge, and food, vegetables. My grandfather was a gardener, so there again we were quite fortunate. But I do remember being short of food, you know, and sort of hungry. One had to be careful that you couldn't have too much. And my mother used to have these kilner jars that she kept food in to preserve it. And it was a great sort of day when all the kilner jars were out in the kitchen. Yeah.
And did you, apart from the rations that would have started, did you get any other sources of food?
Not really. No, we didn't. I seem to remember there was a parcel passed round when there was a pig killed somewhere. That was, I think, an unofficial black market piece of food, which was very nice, because my family was a close family. When my grandmother was alive, the whole family met together for Sunday lunch. But mainly how it affected me was the war was a great time of upheaval for me, because my grandmother died. We went to live with my grandfather, which meant changing school, and the sort of get-togethers of the family didn't happen because my two uncles, three uncles, two were reservists, and one went to the East Coast, the other one was in France and Russia, and my father, who was the reservist, he was in India and Burma, and he went in the first weeks of the war, and we didn't see him. So it was a difficult time.
And was your father able to get home at all, or was he away
I
from
only
home?
remember him coming home twice before embarkation. But he went via South Africa, and I remember unexpectedly a parcel came to the house, and clothing, you know, we had coupons then, you could only have so much clothing, and this parcel was opened and all the clothing in it, and I particularly remember that one cream silk dress with a little pleated with a little pearl button thing just fitted me, and I thought I was a queen bee in it, you know. It was wonderful because I was living on sort of handouts for particularly when I went to work. I had my Aunt Doris's cast-off clothes altered, you know, because they were grown-up clothing. Yeah.
Mm. And did you ever have to help out with any of the gate opening chores at Tabley House at Peacock Lodge?
Well, the chores, the duties of the lodge keeper were to open and close the gates. You know, you couldn't they didn't go in as they freely do now to the estate. And there were large iron gates. And of course, my grandfather was very often busy, or my mother used to open them, and I myself used to open them. And I had got it into a really good rhythm, you know, where you sort of pulled one and then I went backwards, pulled the other one open. And the Leicester Warrens during the war in the evenings, they were sociable people. And I remember one night when I'd opened the gates and the car stopped and the window went down and there's a woman in an evening dress there and she said, "Come here." And she said, "Will you tell, you are very graceful, will you tell your mother to get you to dancing lessons?" And now when I think about it, it just showed how out of touch, you know, they were in those days. And another time, I remember opening the gates. This was coming in, and I was told later, it was a big army car with some jeeps and things behind it. It was General Patton being entertained by the Leicester Warrens. As tenants, we were actually allowed into their private theatre once to see a programme of entertainment because of the war. Normally, we didn't go to the things at all. It was completely private, but they loosened up a little during the war.
Did you make friends with anyone else in the area after you'd moved there?
Yes, my best friend was Wendy Hemming, and I kept that friendship until she died when she was 83. She, like myself, had come to stay with her grandparents because her father had gone into the RAF. He was a Lancaster bomber pilot who actually did all the missions, because a lot of them died, you know, the bombing missions. But he not only did the full missions, but he elected to go and do extra missions and got the Distinguished Flying Cross for doing so. So that was a good thing, which was compensated for change of schools. But the school itself was a village school, and fuel was short there, and sometimes we had to have lessons in the headmistress's house. And I remember sort of concerts, you know, sort of for the war effort. And one particular one, my mother wrote the script for, and I was given the head of being Britannia. And I remember sitting on this throne with a Union Jack in one hand and this great thing on my head. She was very imaginative, my mother. In fact, I remember also one night she woke my sister and I up and insisted that we put our gas masks on, and she herself did, and we were sat up in bed because she firmly believed she had heard the gas rattles, which, you know, they used to do that if the gas. Obviously it wasn't, but we were there for quite a long time. It was quite exciting at first, but got very boring.
Did you ever encounter any of the American troops that were around and about Knutsford at all?
Oh, the American troops. Well, Peacock Lodge was a sort of, you know, entry into one of the entries into Knutsford, and the convoys used to go past. But we used to see them at the Donut Dugout in Knutsford, and obviously my mother and I, and sometimes my sister, used to go to the Marcliffe, and long queues always for the cinema then, and you would see the servicemen queuing up with their girlfriends, and also there, that was a special occasion one night. My mother allowed us to go to the first picture house at the Marcliffe, and then go on to see the second picture house, which is down where the old market hall is now in Knutsford. That was a great treat. The other thing was the balloons. Remember the balloons over at Hatton Park and the parachutists, because they used them for training, you know, jumping.
Did you, what was your favourite subject at school?
My favourite subject at school was drawing, and I was reasonably, you know, good at it. In fact, they wanted me to sort of go on to do something, but in those days I was a very introverted child, and I was expected. My mother, who thought for some reason or other education harmed the brain, thought that I ought to get a job, so I got an interview at Kendal Mills in Manchester to be an apprentice hairdresser. I never managed it because they put me in the antique silver department until there was an opening, and I used to travel to Manchester each day to work. But later on, when my two children had grown up and gone to university, I myself went to art school for 4 years, and I took a degree in fine art. So not in painting or drawing though, although I did do that there, but sculpture, yes, long time ago now.
Had you won a prize for art at school?
Yes, I did. There was a competition for posters in Cheshire, and the school put my poster in because it was an unusual angle. I painted, because of Wendy's father was a Lancaster bomber, I painted a Lancaster bomber, sort of upside down so that you could see the actual bombs coming out. I actually won a prize for it, yes.
So how old were you when you left school, and at what stage of the war would that have been?
I was 14 years old when I left school, and it was quite a change because I had to get up at 7 in the morning and cycle to the station and catch the train. And I didn't get home until about 7:30 at night. That was 6.5 days a week then, because I had to do a Saturday morning. But my memories of that time were Knutsford Station and the old steam trains, and also the awful fogs in Manchester and late trains, and having to leave my bicycle sort of at a lock-up in the station yard. Incident with an American on the train. You had to be very careful in those days because the trains didn't have corridors, and it was difficult to get in and out, you know, with a leather belt. So I always tried to get in with several people in. But I happened once to get myself in a carriage where everyone had got out and there was only another young man and myself, who was actually part of the, he was working at the American Embassy in Manchester, and he tried to make a pass at me, which again I was a very shy girl. Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about your great uncle your Uncle Richard?
Ah, yes. My great uncle Richard, he was in the RAF. He went in early. He was a photographer. He used to have a shop in Knutsford at one time, and he went to Russia before Russia entered the war, had to sign the Official Secrets Act to get there, and the Russians were not very pleased with him there, but what he was doing was they were taking photographs of to bomb the Tirpitz boat, which was successful. And then he went to France, and it was in Paris, and he brought me back my first perfume, and it was Houbigant, Quelque Fleur, and 2 little leather-bound books by Rider Haggard. I still have them. And he was my favourite uncle, and he lived in Knutsford, and I used to go and see him and take him out to lunch in his 80s and was in close contact with him until he died. My other uncles, as I say, were reservists, and they were in reserved occupations.
What about things like getting shoes?
Clothing, yes. Had to go to work in an altered dress of my Aunt Doris, who wasn't the most fashionable person. I must have looked quite quaint. And shoes were difficult. I still have a bunion because coupons were very, very short. And I had a pair of shoes which were seemed okay, but when I started to wear them after about a week, they hurt. And I didn't tell my mother, and they hurt, and they resulted in a bunion. It was rather stupid, really, but I don't think she would have had any more coupons anyway, so I suppose a lot of people suffered this way in the war with clothing.
Did you see any interesting people while you were working in Kendall's department store in Manchester?
Yes, I did. If people were at the Opera House, they very often used to come in to the Kendall Mills, because it was what they known as a very posh store. And I saw Vivian Leigh. And the other thing I saw, which really did interest me, and this stuck in my memory, was a man in a very unusual uniform, and I discovered it was submarine commander's uniform, and I think that's about all. It was very educational, having gone to work in Manchester, because I did stay behind and go to concerts and things that were on at the Opera House in Manchester, and of course I had access on the Saturday to go to the galleries and things like that. So I did continue my education, even though.
Do you have any memories of when peace was declared from VE Day?
Do you know, I don't, and I don't know why. I don't know why. I've searched my brains for that, and I really can't. I can't remember any. Obviously, I remember it on the wireless, as we called it. And that was another thing, sort of getting batteries for the damn thing. It was awful if you wanted your favourite programme and the batteries were running out on the wireless. No, remember the wireless, but we didn't celebrate any particular, in any particular way.
Do you remember your father coming home from India, from the army?
I remember the time when my father returned, and it was like meeting a stranger, and we all felt that, I think. We were sort of treading around each other for a while. But then we were just people, different people in those days. We accepted what we had to do, and we just did it. And it all worked out in the end, so.
Well, had he been changed or altered, do you think, by his experiences in Burma?
Oh, yes, I think so. Yes, I think so. I think he had altered quite a bit. I don't know, he'd actually, I don't know how he managed to do it, but he'd started a book, and which eventually he finished. And heaven knows, I think it was a little bit of a rather wild romance, but whether he had or not, I don't know, possibly.
You talked a little bit about seeing the paratroopers.
Yes.
Obviously training. Can you tell me a little bit about that and how that made you feel seeing them?
Well, paratroopers, the balloons were stationed around Tatton Park, and obviously you could see them, and you could actually see them jumping. That quite frightened me. In fact, I am afraid of heights anyway. And coincidentally, my son he has a vintage plane and he flies. He's not got me up there yet, so perhaps he will one day. I'm a bit of a coward in that respect. But it made me, I believe there were some accidents which I didn't know about parachutists at the time, but I was quite a thoughtful child and quite imaginative, so I did used to wonder, you know, where they were going and what would happen to them, and it's food for thought, you know. It was food, and especially the Americans as well, because they were so different, so very different from us, very loud and easygoing. I didn't have very much to do with them, though. I only saw them as a spectator, not in conversation.
Did you find it quite almost odd seeing all this activity suddenly come around what is generally quite a quiet village or town?
Yes. It was. There was upheaval and uncertainty as well, because you never knew what was going to happen next. You know, you went into Knutsford and it was changed. Life changed, that was the thing, and you did not know what was going to come. You could hear the aeroplanes going over, and you could see the colour of the sky at night. Manchester, when it was being bombed, and that was quite scary because you knew that people were being hurt. Yes, that was salutary.
What kind of emotions came up when you cast your mind back to seeing Manchester essentially on fire?
Yes, well, it did. It was fear and curiosity, and of course it led on to what was happening to my father, because from India he went into Burma. Now when he was an engineer and he was with the Royal Engineers, and he went into Burma and we had no letters and no communication for months at a time when he was in these areas. And also my uncle, you know, we didn't know he was in Russia, of course, but yes, no, my father, that was very wondering what was happening there when you didn't hear.
What kind of emotions came up at home, knowing that you don't know how your father was? How did that affect you back home with the family? Well,
my mother, she's a very stoic, strong woman, and people didn't show their emotions to, you know, children, and we didn't communicate as much as perhaps we do, you know, between my daughter and myself. And she also had, my grandfather had a heart problem, and then she had him ill, so she underwent quite and at one period she was, you know, looking after my grandfather, the gates, the children, the problems. It must have been quite difficult. My uncle's fiancée, my Aunt Ella, used to come up once a week on her bicycle from Knutsford, because she lived in Knutsford, and that was a time of you know, pleasure, and I think that relieved her. And occasionally my uncle Howard would be able to bring my Auntie Vi in her fur coat, who was the one woman in the family, you know, there's always one, isn't there? And my Aunt Doris used to come occasionally, but she was a real misery and would sit by the stove drinking tea. I remember my feelings when my father was away and when he came back. It was awkward because you had a stranger in the house, because it was four years, you know, 5 years before we saw him. And it was difficult for my mother. I don't know whether you sort of bottle these things up, but I do think it affected me. The other thing was that my mother had a late child when he came back, which was, of course, quite a big difference in age. who lives in Knutsford, and I have a relationship with him. But my childhood, we're all affected by childhood memories, and I think in a way I have benefited from being able to contain myself and live in my head. I've always lived in my head, as most of us do, I suppose, and possibly a fantasy life, which I still have, thank God, helps life.
Did you ever have a conversation with your father, since obviously the war ended, about his time serving, or with any of your uncles? Was there any conversation of almost reconciliation about that time being away?
Conversations with my father and uncles about the war. They were very on the surface. They were not men, and I think it was just the time. They didn't talk about their feelings. Although my uncle did mention, we were talking once about his time in Russia, where part of their equipment was in the photography section, and there was one particular piece that, it was very heavy, and the fire broke out, and he was in such a panic, and they were in such a panic, that he grabbed this particular thing and carried it out. Otherwise it would have been, and of course in Russia you can't go and get a spare from the local. And he said to me afterwards that he hadn't been able afterwards to move it. And so it sort of brought into his mind that what is it that biologically he was able to pick up something which he was unable to lift. So I thought that was an interesting thing. I spoke more to my uncle than I did to my father. And we did disagree dreadfully on all sorts of aesthetic things and sometimes politics. And in later years at Christmas time, I remember him particularly getting on his knee, sort of pleading with me to see his point of view. And when I reflected back my views to him, we couldn't agree. But we used to, when he was in his 80s, we used to go out and we went to the pub and we had a pub lunch, and we used to talk about all things. I'm interested in politics. I have my lunch every day with Politics Today. I watch all the sessions on Parliament, Question Time on a Wednesday, etc. Yeah. We'll not mention anything else about that.
Tell me, it was one of those conversations in terms of the disagreements about war?
No. I can't remember what they were about now. I think about it.
Okay.
Oh, I do remember once. Yes, his living room. He had had it redecorated, and to my mind, in the most hideous way, quite plainly, but he'd got these sort of outlines done, sort of with some sort of raised bits, which in his mind made the place look bigger, and I thought it made it look smaller, and that got quite heated, that did.
I'm sure
it was really very bad of me to question something he had done, and was very pleased with.
Yeah. So obviously coming back to with regards to your father, you said he won the Distinguished Flying Cross.
No.
Was that
No, that was Wendy. Wendy's father was a pilot on a Lancaster. Well, you may not know, but Lancaster bomber pilots were very, very few survived. But he did all the missions, and he volunteered to do extra missions and got the Distinguished Flying Cross. Wendy and I were very close. She lived at Holmes Chapel. She travelled, her husband was an engineer, she travelled right round the country, but we always kept in touch and met each other, and she settled back in Holmes Chapel in later years, and I was with her when she was dying, yes, it was...
So tell me a little bit about, obviously, education in school and how it was before the war, and how, if anything, it changed following or during the war.
My earliest experiences of school, I was too young to really give you an approximation of whether it changed very much, because I was 9 when the war started, and I had just changed school, so that's a difficult one for me. All my memories are that we were sometimes cold, and we certainly had to have the use of the headmistress's house, which joined it, to have lessons, which of course was really quite exciting because you weren't in a desk, you know, you were sitting round in a room. And I had left school and was working, so I had no more experience of it then. But of course, I mean, obviously, a village school and the education you got is nothing like it is today. No, you had to sit with your arms behind, like this. That's how you sat at school. I can't do it now because of arthritis, but and you did get your fingers rattled with them, you know. And it was school invoked, I think, in me because of the change of schools was a feeling of a fear, really, because you had to be the right person and do the right thing, and you didn't know quite where you were. So I'm afraid I really can't help you on the change, but obviously there must have been a change. Yes.
That's okay. So obviously with regards to maybe going down to the corner shop to get some food, how was that before the war, and how was it afterwards?
Now, food, because we lived outside Knutsford, it entailed walking into Knutsford and then having a queue to get food, which was difficult. We had no corner shop. We had to rely on ourselves. So the Kilner jars of food that my mother did, the rabbits that my grandfather occasionally managed to trap, and the vegetable plot were essential. And really, we were lucky, you know, not like living actually in Knutsford. It possibly, if you didn't have a garden or anything like that, must have been much more difficult. Much more difficult. But I do remember having to walk into Knutsford to queues to get various things like bread. But we did have meat, which was delivered actually. It was Dyson's, I think. Dyson's, yes, which is in the lower street, which the building is still there. My uncle was friendly with one of the brothers there, yes. Mm.
And what about rations when the war started?
Rations.
How did that impact you?
Rations, because I was only 9, my memories are that food was short in the house and you didn't have large portions. And so I presume that one's stomach accommodated. But I do remember that looking enviously at things like biscuits and then knowing that I couldn't have one. More difficult for my sister, who was 5 years younger, because that was a difficulty. I remember the supplements we had, the orange juice and the rosehip syrup. My mother did some rosehip syrup once, yes. In fact, when we were married, rations were still on. My husband and I were still on. At that time, I was working in the research department at ICI, and because I actually I did leave. I never became a hairdresser. I left and went to Boots and took a course and became a dispenser. Then went on to ICI. We had our main meal and then we had a very light meal in the evening. But food was still short when I got married at 23. We were still feeling the... And when we were married, we did have a motorbike and travelled on to the continent, to France. And you could see there was quite a bit of devastation in Paris. Even then, you know. Yeah, and if you went into Manchester or Liverpool, that was also was completely, large gaps and buildings still wanting renovation.
How did that make you feel, seeing places that you might have seen before, or new places being so devastated by war?
When I see the television showing photographs and films of the devastation, I haven't experienced it myself, and it does, it's salutary that we're extremely lucky that we've lasted so long. The only thing that worries me about it being on so often, that I do think it does have a deadening effect on a lot of people, and they regard it merely as a film. They don't really see what is happening. They see it, but they don't understand the true meaning of war and the true meaning of what it means to lose your home. We were very lucky in the war not to be overtaken, because we're an island. To have lived like Palestine does, with perpetual thing, I feel very strongly about that.
Do you feel like the war was worth it? Because you talk about...
Was it worth it? Well, it was mistakes, wasn't it? I mean, looking back, as far as I can see, Germany was, in a state of such... we left it after World War I in such a state that something was going to happen, and Hitler took advantage of it. But you couldn't put up with a man like Hitler at all. I think we had to do it. There's no mistake about that. And I think if they'd invaded, all people's instincts would have been to fight it, to have an underground like France did. Worth it. Well, at least we moved on, and we were not like the First World War. We were not saying, well, how many thousand can we afford to lose today? The people in charge. There was a little bit more. But I don't think the German people wanted it any more than we did.
How old were you when the war ended?
I was 15 when the war ended. Let's hope we don't have another one.
Did you recognise any change in Knutsford following off the back of the end of the war?
When the war ended, I was still travelling into Manchester, so my memories of Knutsford are... I was not actually living there, but I was still travelling and using it for leisure, at weekends. And then, at the age of 23, I got married, and I went to live in Weaverham. And I've only been living back here in Knutsford for the last 21 years. And of course, there is a big change, an enormous change. It has become posher, but I still see the same. I can still see the same people that I associated with when I worked. I used to work at Boots in Knutsford, and I also was a member of the Amateur Dramatic Little Theatre, and I still, have people that I do know, at least one at the end of the road, Gaskell Avenue, Pat, who was a May Queen. It's just, I think Knutsford has moved with the times. I think, let's say that. It's moved with the times, possibly a little bit farther forward, a bit farther towards the gentrification.
What makes Knutsford home for you?
Because it's the place, the focus. I lived in several, places beforehand, but I was always in and around Knutsford. And for me, particularly, the pleasure of Knutsford are memories of, I go where past my uncle's shop when he was a photographer. Aesthetically, it's a beautiful place. to walk through and enjoy, and going into Tatton Park, and people are friendly, and I can see people that I know there. And although I now have to go on a mobile scooter sometimes, although I have managed to walk to Waitrose, and it's improved. I mean, at least we've got a little Waitrose there, and several other facilities. So Knutsford, it's just home, to go and sit down by the moor and watch the ducks. And I think everyone that I know that has visited me has loved it. It's just got an appeal. It's got history, and after all, that's what makes us. I mean, I'm an atheist. No, let me say agnostic, but I probably visit more churches, and it's mainly for the sense of history that I find. And Knutsford has that. It's got a sense of history.
Perfect. Just one more thing I want to ask, and then we're there, if that's okay. Obviously, you had some really nice lines about Knutsford and this sense of community, the sense of family around you. I'm asking how that changed, or more so, what impact it had on you when you had to say goodbye to so many people's fathers and your uncles. How was that?
The upheaval in the family due to the war, with the loss of the general meetings of the family. My grandmother, when she was alive, always had Sunday lunch, and all the family came, my uncles and aunts. And suddenly she was dead, and the war started, and that was gone. And one didn't see, it was as if part of one's stability had been suddenly eroded. And it was worrying, because you knew that the men were going into places where, because my uncle Bert went to from Northwich into Ipswich on a reserved occupation. I think they were, had problems there. And my uncle Richard, my father, you didn't know whether you'd ever see them again. And it was just a sense of loss, and something wasn't quite right as a child. It had gone, and I don't actually remember the, if I'm perfectly honest, the actual goodbyes, but I knew that they were gone. It was a sense of something, part of you was missing, part of your essential family tree had been split, been pruned. Yes. I don't know, I can't really think of how else to put it. I used to want, because I was fortunate, one thing about living with my grandfather on an estate was I was allowed to wander freely about the estate, and as you know, the estate has a wonderful old hall on an island, and there's also a sort of tower on the other island, which is marvellous for a child who an imagination. And I spent hours by myself wandering about this place, thinking about, well, people and things, and thinking what could have happened there. And Wendy and I used to sort of climb across the bridge and go into the old hall, which was dangerous. We shouldn't have done it. And of course that was very spooky. She was affected by her father going away, possibly more than I was. I don't know. Yeah. But we had that in common, and we were friends. And we were both two strangers coming to a village school.